welcome back, everyone. It's time for another Ask Evoke session with Kylee, Toth, and myself, Scott Johnston from Evoke Endurance. And we've got another batch of great questions. They just keep coming. And many of these are challenging to answer. So that's kind of good. It makes us have to think about it. But before we dive in, though, you'll notice that Kylee, if you're watching on YouTube, you'll notice that there is no Kylee video. We'll just get audio from her because she's in a rather exotic location at the moment. So why don't you fill us in on where you are and what you're doing?
For sure. Yeah. And thanks, Scott. It's fun to meet with you again. And yeah, I'm in the Pyrenees in France right now, headed to Ski Mountaineering World Cup in Andorra this weekend. So I'm in a 200-year-old stone house where the Wi-Fi and cell data doesn't work super great. So yeah, no, you can't see my face this round, but next month I'll be back. And yeah, been enjoying some racing. We just came from Azerbaijan as well, where we had a World Cup, and it's been a good adventure so far.
Well, we won't hold it against you that we can't see you this week or this month. But well, let's just dive right in because we've got a fair number of these to do, and we'll just hope that our internet connection stays good enough. So yeah.
Okay. So our first question is from Dan, and he says, the podcast, I enjoy listening to it very much. I have a question about energy deficiency overtraining. Exactly 2 years ago, I stopped training for my first 100-mile run due to mild headaches, chest pains, low libido, trouble sleeping, and other symptoms. I was very naive, had no idea how important calories are. Now, 2 years later, things are much better, and 2 weeks ago, I completed my first 50-kilometer run. The run went very well, and my recovery was okay. What would you advise someone who is recovering from energy deficiency syndrome and has made good progress so far? Do you have specific tips or advice for this phase of recovery? So that's from Dan.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. The combination of REDS, relative energy deficiency syndrome, and overtraining syndrome often go hand in hand, and they're pretty easy to it's hard to distinguish like what's going on. So we just have to assume that they're kind of a mingling or a combination, I think, of these things. And it sounds like you targeted, Dan, you did a good job of figuring this out, and you found out, oh, I just wasn't eating enough. That's great. I would say that you just, continue to do that, but be mindful of your recovery. Maybe you need to be especially careful to have some kind of high calorie, high carbohydrate recovery drink or snack or something. So immediately finishing a workout, you can dive into that. And I would say, if it's 2 weeks since your 50K and you're almost they were almost gone, excuse me, the symptoms are almost gone after 2 weeks after the 50K, that's a good indication that you're not in that same stage anymore. Many people will feel the effects of a 50-kilometer run, for 2 weeks. That's quite normal. So don't worry about that. It's very rare that, would be just somebody who's very elite and has raced a lot that could might feel better a week or 10 days out. But the fact that it was 2 weeks, I think there's nothing at all wrong with that. So I don't think there's anything significant that would need to be changed. Do you have any thoughts on that, Kylee?
Yeah, I think in working with one other client who had really severe overtraining syndrome is just really monitoring those symptoms and backing off if they return at all. But I agree with, sounds like he's kind of addressed it and troubleshooted with the calorie deficit he was running. So that's quite interesting that that was the reasoning. But for sure, you do burn way more calories If you've never ultra ran before and then dive into it, of course you would to change your diet. So that reminds people too.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's, it's
Mhm.
I've done a fair bit of testing with some elite ultra runners, and we test them for what the test is called an energy substrate utilization test. So we're trying to figure out how much carbohydrate they need to be consuming during the race. And what we're seeing is for a 160-pound guy running pretty fast, the front of the pack in an ultra running race, we're seeing the usage of carbohydrate at 200 grams per hour being used by the muscles. Well, that's way more than you can take in. So, so let's say even if you're, running slower and not going quite as long, and you're still using 120 grams per hour, that's what your body's using, that's still going to be very hard to take in 120 grams per hour while you're training. So that's all the more reason to have some kind of high carbohydrate drink or snack readily available, like keep it in the car so that when you get back to the trailhead, you can just guzzle it down while you're driving
Mhm.
home.
Yeah, for sure. That's a good reminder for people. And yeah, it's kind of mind blowing how uh, a carb, especially that you burn. So
Yeah.
good. Moving on to our next question, Scott. We have a question from Angelos, and he's asking a question regarding the percentage allocation of training hours during the week to add more hours into his training. So he has a full-time job 5 days per week and takes advantage of all of the available hour training. It has been said that the longest workout for a given week should be 30 to 50% of the weekly load, he is saying. He says he currently trains for 10 to 11 hours per week, but half of those hours are in one single day. He says, would it be wise to increase my weekly load by adding more hours during the days that I am free of work? In that case, one day of the week might eventually have 60 to 70% of the weekly load. Long days in the mountains is what he loves to do, but he doesn't want to sacrifice improvement. And then he sums it up with, in other words, can one be a weekend warrior without being a couch potato during the week? So,
That's a great way to put it. It doesn't sound like you're the couch potato during the week. If you're
mhm.
basically training as much as you can on those 5 work days, then you're maxed out on that. And adding, typically we suggest to most people with jobs that the weekends are going to be when they have the most time to train. I would say, if you end up with, let's say you're training 10 hours, because it's a nice, easy number to work with. And if you're eventually shooting or thinking you're going to get 70% of your weekly load in that one day, that is a lot. So that would be 7 out of the 10 hours. I would suggest, if it's at all possible, spreading that to both days on the weekend, spread out that. So there's maybe, 3 hours on Saturday, 3 hours on Sunday. And then there's not only just, I think that's going to be more beneficial for you and handleable than going for a 7-hour run, but it also has the added benefit of the first day, you can go for a 3-hour run, you're going to be depleting your glycogen stores quite dramatically. And that means the next day, even if you eat well, you will not have fully restored your glycogen stores for that next run the next day. So that makes that second day's run even more effective. Because as we've talked about many times before, one of the main stimulus, if not the most important stimulus for increasing mitochondrial function and mitochondrial mass is glycogen depletion. And so being a little glycogen depleted when you start that second day will make that more beneficial. But keeping those runs closer to 3 hours means that they're not going to take anywhere near as long to recover from. So I don't think they'll impact your weekly, midweek mileage as much.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's good advice, Scott, because it for most mere humans, it is hard to recover if they go out for like 8 to 10 hours or something, you know. So
Yeah, I
yeah,
think
for
pretty much
sure.
anybody. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Good. Um, so our next question is from Jessie, and she says, "Hi, I'm training for a 60K trail run in April. I usually strength train at lunch. However, I don't have to get to the gym on lunch break. I am close to an ice rink with public skating. I grew up figure skating competitively through 8th grade, so I have a good background. I was wondering if ice skating is good cross training or perhaps substitute for some strength training for trail running. I'd also love to hear other ideas you have about cross training on a tight schedule." So, um,
Yeah. Well, this is right up your alley. I
yeah.
mean, what do you think of in terms of, I mean, you're a speed skater, but
Hmm.
what do you think of in terms of using that for muscular endurance type training or even strengthening using skating?
I think it a couple times a week, but I don't think it would be a big enough stimulus to replace your strength training. I was a national team speed skater, so that has a very huge muscular endurance load. And even then, we did strength training on top of our speeding. So um, I think it's great, especially if it's a passion for Jesse to go and skate because you've got to keep things well, and it will have some muscular effect, especially if she skates vigorously. Um, but definitely, she still needs to keep that strength training in there, in my opinion. Um, yeah, that's what I'd say.
Well, and another thought on that would be that perhaps, I think doing a day or two of this a week is, especially if it's something you love to do, I'm sure it will feel good and it may actually feel like a recovery workout compared to running.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not pounding on you. But if you wanted to try to sneak in a little more running or trail running specific work during that lunch break, now that you do not have a gym access, there's a couple of things I might suggest you could just do in your office or wherever, maybe outside the building. One would be, if it's a tall building, is to use the stairs and hike up
Mm-hmm.
and down those stairs a lot during your lunch break. Um, that has worked tremendously well, and if you all you need is to load up a backpack with, 10 to 20% of your body weight and run up and down those stairs or hike up and down those stairs. And that would be a great and very specific type training that will carry over to your run training. But another option would be to use our little gym muscular endurance program that we call it the gym muscular endurance just because it's typically not done outdoors. But it's doesn't require almost any equipment at all. The only thing, if you get pretty strong with it, you may want to begin to add some extra resistance, and you can do that by putting a little bit of weight into a pack. But most people will see really big benefits from that muscular endurance training, even with just body weight. So there's a huge article on the website about, muscular endurance training. You can search for that. And in it, we have a giveaway. I think it's even a PDF you can download. If not, it's all laid out in the article on how to do these workouts and how to progress them week after week. But I think those could be, one of those per week, midweek,
Mm-hmm.
would be great. And the gym muscular endurance could easily be done, in an office. I know lots of people that do it in their living room. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and most ice rinks have bleachers and it'd be nice and cool there. You could even do it at the ice rink, perhaps.
that's
Hmm.
true. Could run up and
Yeah.
down those bleachers, or just do if it's close by, yeah, you could do
Yeah,
your muscular endurance workout outside, or maybe it's inside. People would
for sure.
be interested to watch you.
Yes. Yeah. Good. Question is from Dan, and he said, "I've been training using the first ultra plan, but had extra time before my race. So I've been adding base focused with minimal aerobic work above zone 2, since that is the area I need to improve upon. I've been struggling to see a significant increase in my zone 2 pace and have been trying to troubleshoot. I noticed that even when starting at heart rates 10% below my aerobic threshold, I often see drift above 5%, as outlined in the drift test, even with adequate hydration and cooling. Is this an indicator that I need to reduce my training pace even further or otherwise modify my training? I originally set my aerobic threshold based on a stepped lactic testing and found the beats, which was roughly the spot where my lactate jumped above 2 millimole. It seems to correlate well to where I feel ventilation pickup. Thanks in advance, from Dan. That's a good
Yeah,
question.
it's a really good question. And there could be a number of reasons why you're not seeing an improvement in zone 2 running pace. And it could be that laboratory test, and I'm not saying it is this way, but it's possible that it pegged your lactate threshold, this first move in the lactate, the first threshold, at a higher pace and higher heart rate than you're doing outdoors or can do outdoors. And so I would encourage you to do the heart rate drift test and see if how that number correlates with what you got out of your step test from the lactate testing. And so that would be my first place to start, is see if you're using that properly. But clearly, if your heart rate is rising or going from 10 feet below or 10% below your aerobic threshold to 5% above, that's an increase of 15%. That's pretty significant and would indicate to me that their pace is too fast. And so I know it can be discouraging, but you may need to, slow that pace down a little bit, so you can keep the drift in the right order or in the right range. But another thought is that if you've been doing this, I don't know how long you've been on this training program, but it might be not a bad idea, and I think that's in the first ultra plan, is to start adding some faster training in. But I don't mean going out and running for an hour in zone 3. What I mean is doing some hill sprints and doing some strides while running. So there's quite an extensive article in Training for the Uphill Athlete on how to do hill sprints, but they will build leg power. And the same thing with running strides, where you accelerate up to during a normal run, you would accelerate up to what I call a fun, fast pace. It's something that feels good. It's certainly not a full sprint. And you hold that for 10 to 15 seconds and then slow down and jog easy for 3 minutes, and do that several times in, let's say you're going for a 30-minute run. Maybe you can fit in 4 or 5 of those. And both of those, the hill sprints and the strides, will increase leg power, which means you will travel farther through the air. It'll increase your stride length. So your strides will become longer. You'll be spending more time in the air and less time on the ground while you're running. And that's what's called running economy, when your stride length gets longer. So those can be a good way to supplement the zone 2 training.
Yeah, Scott, would you also suggest he does the aerobic threshold test until he finds that 3 under 5% is zone
Yes,
2
I would
training?
say
Just get an accurate heart rate?
I think that's going to be, I don't know how many times it will take you, Dan, to do the drift test. It's sort of an iterative process. You start with a heart rate you assume is going to be okay, and then you see what the drift is at the end. And if it was too high, you slow yourself down and do the test again. The beauty of these tests are they're free. Don't have to go to a lab and spend hundreds of dollars, and you can do them anytime you want. You could even do them, on consecutive days, because the intensity is quite low.
Mm-hmm.
So, I would say that, do the drift test until you get it figured out that you find a heart rate that requires you or that does not climb more than 5%.
Yeah. Good. That sounds like a good approach for Dan. So our next question, Scott, is from Maxwell, and he says, "I have a question about a touchy subject, weight loss. I have a 60K, my first ultra, coming up in 14 weeks. I've been slowly ramping up my running volume and incorporating cross training, but I'm 20 pounds overweight and I would love to shed some pounds for the race as well. I know that there is a trade off between weight loss and injury risk, and that being in a calorie deficit can be dangerous for high volume training. Body mass is also a risk factor for running injuries. My question is, how should I balance weight loss and increased running volume in my training block? My ultimate goal is simply to run the best race I can. There's been a lot of focus on red S recently, which is great, but I am having a hard time finding answers as someone who is genuinely overweight and is not subject to the same risks at all. For reference, I'm 5'10" male and I weigh 185 pounds." Mhm.
Okay. Yeah, the relative energy deficiency REDS is something that has, the last few years, has gained a lot of traction. And I think when it comes to this, I'm really reticent to suggest to people that they restrict calories when they're training. Now,
Mhm.
what that might mean is that this 20 extra pounds you'd like to shed just may take more time to get rid of than before you've only got 14 weeks before your 60K. I think if you were to put yourself on some sort of calorie restriction diet, that it could really hamper your training and preparation for that race. I think it'd be better to go to that race a little overweight, but with lots of energy, than it would be to show up at the starting line, having been overtrained or have REDs. Because you're in 60 kilometers, you're going to be needing all the calories you can get into your body during that run. And so think about how long it took you to put on those 20 pounds. It took you
Mhm.
probably a lot longer than 14 weeks, probably more like 14 years. And so it's not reasonable to think that you can suddenly shed those 20 pounds in just a few weeks. I just think the risk is very high. You might consider when you eat and how you're eating, and maybe adjust the balance of fat to carbohydrates. So you're taking in a little more fat and a little less carbohydrates, and like stay away, of course, from highly processed, really sugary foods, despite how yummy they are. I think that's one of the easiest ways to get back onto a healthy diet and get a healthy weight. But the other thing is you might consider doing some of the early, like if you run early in the morning, you might consider doing one or two of your easy zone 1, zone 2 runs in a fasted state. So let's say they're an hour long and you get up in the morning, you have no calories at all, go out the door, run easily for an hour, come back, and then eat immediately. Don't try to starve yourself all day long for that, or even till lunch. Come back, eat a normal, reasonable breakfast. And then the other thing is, don't eat like a high glycemic or a high caloric, high carbohydrate meal after, let's say, 6 o'clock at night, because then your body is sort of shutting down because it's getting ready to go to sleep and your metabolism slows. And so all of those carbohydrates that you just took in, some of them are going to, insulin takes those carbohydrates and puts that into the muscle cell. And there will be some need for that. But most of us overeat carbohydrates late in the day. And what happens then is those carbohydrates are basically just turned into fat and are stored as fat because your body doesn't need them at that point because it's already filled up the the muscles with all the glycogen that they can handle. So those would be a couple of suggestions I would try, but I think patience is going to be the biggest thing for you.
Yeah, that's such great advice, Scott. I was gonna say the same thing about the fasted runs, but I agree. Like we've as coaches, we all probably train somebody who has because it's the reality of being human for many people. And the approach I take, and I is is with good diligent training and advice that you said about sort of clean eating and being mindful of when you intake calories, a lot of people do just slowly lose weight. And so um, hopefully that will be the case for him as well. But I definitely agree with you. I really hesitate people to quote unquote diet and train. It's it's a bit of a dangerous place for energy. Hmm.
And here's something that just occurred to me. That's great advice as well. But something, Maxwell, you might consider is if you're doing much heavy strength training, weightlifting, that would be something I would drop for the time being,
Hmm.
because what we have seen is a lot of people that come to us with a strength training background, and yes, maybe their body mass says that they're overweight, but actually all that is muscle. But when we start them running and reduce the strength stimulus, they immediately start to shed some excess muscle mass. And we see this especially with some of the military guys we work with who, have come with a lot of strength training background and not very much endurance training. And as soon as we put them into a running program, they start to get leaner and smaller. So that will be another, if you're doing much strength training, you might consider that, just
Hmm.
cutting back on it.
Yeah, that's great advice. So our next question is from Tori from Canada, and they have a 2-week vacation coming up from work and don't have any plans, but would like to make the most of it to get as aerobically fit as possible. Is it possible to push significantly higher volume during this time versus my average, since I'll be able to sleep and eat significantly more? I was thinking of going to BC or Washington to cross country ski, run, and downhill ski every day. Thanks. Mhm.
Yeah, Tori, you can do that. It's kind of that model of training, which is, we would call this like a overreaching block of training, because you're going to make this big increase in training volume during that time and overall training load. It's a little bit like when an athlete goes to a training camp. And so now normally those training camps aren't 2 weeks long, they're often just a week, because that's enough when somebody's training a pretty high volume. But I would say that the simplest way to manage this, go ahead and do, as much aerobic work as you can during that time, given your energy levels and sleep and eating and all that. But I would say that the easiest way to handle this will be to do a taper the week before you go into this trip. Is cut back more than 50%, probably more like 60 or 70% of your training, and have a very light week so that you're well rested going into that week. And then don't overdo it on days 1 and 2 and 3, because you'll have all this energy. Don't go crazy then. You want to be able to kind of spread out your energy use over this 2-week period. And then the second thing I would recommend is, when you return, give yourself at least a week of recovery. So another very light week to allow your body to absorb all of that training stimulus that you did during those 2 weeks.
Mhm. Yeah, they reminds me of athletes do training camps. So it's like you said, an overreaching blocker, that kind of concept. Um, that's some good advice. I would, a personal experience, warn you not to go too hard, as Scott said, on the first few days, or else you'll just be completely exhausted. So, ease your way in your vacation.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
Good. Our next question, Scott, is from Nicole, and she says, "Hello, Scott and Kylee. Thank you so much for your amazing podcast and book club videos on YouTube, which I rewatch again and again. I have a question about how to approach mountain races as a flatlander. I live in Berlin, Germany, and will be running CCC this year. I have done a few races on mountains in Germany last year, but the highest elevation I climbed in those was around 1,200 meters. I am wondering how to approach CCC from a travel perspective. Would it make sense to be in Chamonix 2 weeks earlier to get used to the environment and up the mountains a few times? Or does it not really matter since the race starts at a lower altitude? Would it make sense to plan in a few long weekends, 3 to 4 days over the next month over there, or is the stress of travel not worth it and my training time is better spent here using the treadmill for uphill work and a local hill for hill sprints? I would be super grateful if you could answer this on your podcast. Many thanks."
Yeah, well, we work with a lot of folks who are what we call terrain challenged. They live in flat places. And so you'll need to be clever about trying to build some training in that has elevation gain and loss, or at least conditions you for elevation gain and loss. One of the tried and true methods that we have used repeatedly with people is that gym muscular endurance routine that I mentioned a couple questions ago. So I would look into that, see if you can fit that into your weekly schedule. It will go a long way towards increasing the fatigue resistance in your legs, especially for the downhills. The other would be if you have access to a tall building in Berlin, which I would assume there are many, then you could use the stairs, the fire stairs inside of a building like that to hike up and down. Those would, I think, be really effective midweek type training sessions for you. And then I don't know about, maybe it's not necessary to travel all the way to Chamonix. What about going, into southern Germany, near Munich, like let's say forgot the name of those little mountains there. But anyway, I think you know what I'm talking about. There's a bunch of beautiful, relatively small mountains. They still have snow on them, but I know there's lots of trails there. I have worked with people who've trained there quite a bit. I think it's Berchtesgaden, something that's an area that's there. Anyway, I would try to take a couple of long weekends in the springtime as you're getting ready, or over the summer as you're getting ready for the CCC, and get on some really hilly mountainous terrain. That's not going to be, I think that the problem with the CCC, or not the CCC, but the problem with traveling all the way to Chamonix is, yes, it's going to be tiring. It's probably going to be more costly. And I don't know that there's going to be that much advantage. The main advantage you might get is you might learn the course and be able to understand what's around the next corner. Is it a big climb, or is it a descent and flats? So that would be the advantage of doing that. But I don't know. I wouldn't do it 2 weeks before the race, though. That's one I would not recommend, because all you're going to likely do is get yourself pretty tired before the race. And because you're going to be hanging out there and you're going to be excited or nervous, and the temptation to go out the door and go for runs in the mountains might be too great. And then you're going to stand on the starting line with tired legs. So I would not do anything that was particularly demanding after about more than 3 weeks, after 3 weeks to the race. So, give yourself, you could do a big weekend on that weekend of 3 weeks before the race, but then start cutting back.
Yeah, Scott, I'd really echo that, especially the 2 weeks before the event. I know from personal experience, it's super hard to control yourself in a new place. And if anything, you'll just ruin your taper by
Yeah.
by going there too early. So you'd have to be really self-controlled. Um, and then there's probably not much point because you can't check out so much of the course without tiring yourself. So
Yeah.
yeah, really agree on that point for sure. Mm. So our next question, Scott, is from Karen. And she says, I'm training for 2 peaks in Nepal in 10 weeks' time, and I'm a real sweater, all in capitals. I get twitchy calf muscles after some of my long zone 2 workouts, and I know I need electrolytes. How important are electrolytes for recovery, and how do I know if I'm consuming too much? I'm a bit nervous of all the sodium as back in the day it caused hypertension. I love Evoke Endurance and Maya is an amazing coach. Yes, we agree, Maya. We also agree Maya is an amazing coach. Thanks,
Yeah.
Karen. Yeah.
Um,
Uh-huh.
Good question. You know, this whole thing of cramping and sweating, this is something that has been studied for years, and I don't think there's a definitive answer of, how much electrolyte you need. Now, granted, if you're a heavy sweater, then you probably should be taking some kind of sodium replenishment during the when you're hiking, or during your workouts, especially the longer ones. Um, I don't know how much it's related to hypertension. I honestly have seen conflicting studies on that as well. So, and if you're going to be doing this, if you're sweating it off, maybe it doesn't matter that you're taking in more. You're not increasing your plasma sodium levels. So that would be something I guess I don't know, you might want to talk to a doc about that. Is there a way to measure it? And if you're worried about hypertension, I mean, if you already have high blood pressure, is that a problem for you? Then yeah, that could be difficult. But I think just there are lots of electrolyte additives for drinks these days that taste pretty good, and they've got, potassium and sodium, calcium in them. And those are really important things to take in, especially the potassium, in that it's one of the mechanisms for firing muscles. And if you're low on potassium, then the muscles don't fire like they should, and that could have something to do with your twitchy calf muscles. But the main thing I've noticed over the years with people who sweat a lot and get cramping, which it sounds like you're kind of on the verge of cramping when you say twitchy calf muscles, is you just need more aerobic work.
Mm.
And eventually, you'll overcome that. I've seen it many times where, people who are relatively fit, but hadn't done a lot of long duration, low intensity work, they will get cramps because they're out for several hours and they're sweating a bunch, and they'll get cramps and be miserable. And then, 6 months later, a year later, when they've built a good aerobic base, they never have that problem again. So I don't know of any science that backs that up, but that's just been my observation over the years.
Yeah, I agree, Scott. Unless it's, you know, super, super, super hot and people are falling down with the heat stroke, often the answer is more muscular endurance. So, yeah, a combination of those two. And then I think she specifically mentioned the electrolytes for recovery. And yes, like if you, as soon as you're done training, having something in your water, um, if you have a protein drink or something, you could add some other electrolyte powders. There's so many great ones out there now that tick a lot of the boxes. So I think for sure adding that into your recovery routine as soon as possible is ideal. Mhm.
Yeah.
The next question is also on kind of fueling, so it segues in. Someone is asking, what are our thoughts on the use of ketones and sodium bicarb for training and racing?
Yeah, this is an area that I'm certainly no expert on, but I have worked with athletes that use both of those. And so I'll give you, again, my observations from it. Some of them really think ketones, so we'll start with ketones, that ketones are incredibly useful for them. Now, the theory behind ketones in endurance sports is that it's going to conserve your glycogen stores. Because the ketones that go in are converted to glucose in your liver. So it's exogenous ketones is what we're talking about. Your body already makes ketones on its own. This is talking about taking supplemental ketones on top of that. There's a couple of problems is that normally the ketone drinks taste terrible. So they may even kind of upset your stomach a little bit. And it takes some getting used to, and you'll need to try them in training and see if you can notice any benefit. And then with the sodium bicarb, same thing. I've had athletes, and I know Kylee, you've played around with sodium bicarb. There are people who swear by it, and there's people who swear off of it. They're like, "I'll never do that. I tried it once and it threw up," or that kind of thing. So, like many supplement questions we get, I often tell people, do it for a week or 10 days and see if you notice a difference in your training. And if you do, then hopefully it's a positive difference. Then you'll have done this experiment of I wouldn't do it in a race. I would definitely do it far away from a race to find out how it affects you. And then if it proves beneficial, then you can shift it over to using it in a race.
Yeah, I agree, Scott. I don't have experience with the ketones, but I personally do use sodium bicarb. I'm an athlete with Morton, so I use their product. Um, and I'd say with that one, especially, it's about the right dosing too for your weight. So make sure um, that you follow the instructions of whatever brand you're using. And then again, for some people it's a toss up because bicarbonate or sodium bicarbonate is hard on your stomach. So um, practicing with it, and then most of the athletes I know who use it or who have found success with it, it's shorter duration activities. So because it's a lactic buffer, so kind of what, over 1 minute to 8 minutes, so shorter races, maybe up to a 5K. But yeah, that's largely who I've heard that it helps best for. But again, with like you said, Scott, I'm not a nutritionist, but I certainly use it and do think it helps. So
Yeah. And
yeah.
I've worked with 100-mile racers that, sodium bicarbonate shouldn't be you wouldn't think it would be an ergogenic aid in a 100-mile race. But
No, yeah,
I've worked with athletes that swear that it's works
yeah,
for them. It's great. So again, I just think you need to try this stuff out and see if you can feel a difference.
for
And
sure.
both of those are expensive too.
It's
Ketones,
true.
especially the ketones, are very expensive.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw, because I'm Canadian, one of our Tour de France riders from Canada, Mike Woods, last year, he was shoveling and they would hand him the bicarb on the bike. So that's another
Mhm.
endurance event. But I wonder with the 100 milers or the tour, if they ingest multiple doses of it throughout the race. I'm not sure, but yeah.
I would suspect that they do. Yeah,
Yeah.
I would
Yeah.
think they would.
Hmm.
That's where I first heard about both ketones um, and the sodium bicarbonate was a few years ago. One of the athletes I coach and I were consulting with the the high performance manager for the Ineos Grenadier Tour de France team.
Mm, okay.
And we got all kinds of information on how those guys say they were benefiting from this. Now, some of it could be placebo. And some of it just could be, groupthink. Everybody else is
Yeah.
doing it. I better do it too. I don't know. I mean, I don't have any
Mhm.
personal experience. I just am relating what I have heard and seen from athletes. And it spans, as I said, the whole, from the love it to hate it spectrum.
Yeah, it would be incredibly challenging to test to see if that actually works. Like y- because it's buffering the lactate. So even with a lactate meter, I don't necessarily think you could definitively say, um, like if you wanted
Yeah.
to try to see if it was working. Um,
Yeah.
but anyways, our next question, Scott, is from an ultra runner, and they're asking, how would training differ between training for 100 miles and 200 plus mile ultra race?
Um, well, I don't think it has to be very different, honestly. I mean, I've worked with people doing 200-mile races, and their training didn't look a lot different than the people doing 100-mile races, and it worked really well for them. One of the things you have to consider that in a 200-mile race, you're going to be doing a lot of walking. And whereas in a 100-mile race, unless it's extremely hilly, like hard rock or something, you're going to be running more than you can for 200 miles. So what that means is you need to train to walk. You need to do a lot of your training needs to be done with a walking stride versus a running stride. Because believe it or not, it's possible to be good at walking and bad at walking. So we take it so for granted that we don't think there's technique involved. But go out sometime, even on the flats on a nice soft trail, and try to walk a 12-minute mile. And yet we work with a number, well, actually, one of our coaches, Vince Pikowski, who holds the Army's 12-mile ruck record, his average pace with the weight, the pack on his, heavy pack on his back was in the 7 to 7:30 per mile pace. So very fast. Now, some of that's obviously running, but a lot of it is walking on the uphills. And I think getting efficient at walking fast is so important because that's you're going to use that tool a lot in a 200-mile race.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I've trained an athlete for Tour de Jean and Tour de Glaciers. Or sorry, what's the other one? There's Tour.
There's Tour de
Yes,
Géant and
yeah,
Tour de Glacier. Yeah. Well, and
yeah,
the Tour
and
de Glacier is the mega I don't know,
yes.
300 miles or some crazy distance. Yeah.
And I just I had an athlete who completed it this year, and a lot of, I'd say 90% of her training was, like you were saying, long, long walks. So,
Mhm.
I think being an incredibly efficient walker at that, and also this is kind of a funny thing to say, but eater, like training yourself to be able to eat because you're out for so long, and stomach upset is a huge day ender for
Mhm.
those athletes. So, and eating
Yeah.
real food because um, in excess of 100 miles, you're going into days of walking. So you need to start ingesting not just gels and powders. So,
Yeah. And the
yeah.
advantage being in those lower and longer races that are even lower intensity, it's easier to eat real food because
Hmm.
you're not running as much. So
Yeah.
anyway, yeah, I would just say think about training by walking a lot.
Yeah.
Um,
I would agree. Yeah.
and some of it pretty fast.
Yes. The next question we have is someone is asking, how does training affect cortisol levels? Does it depend on the type, strain, etc.? Does it depend on the time of day? Generally wondering about small changes I may be able to implement to improve levels. I enjoy getting out into the mountains whenever I can. I've started a transition period where I know I need to focus on fixing aerobic deficiencies. Do you think spending a day in the mountains working above aerobic threshold for a big period of time and doubling my planned workload for the week is short-sighted? So this person has a couple questions in
Yeah, a
here.
couple questions here. Let's
Why don't
start
we
with the
tackle the
cortisol question.
cortisol? Yeah.
Yeah. So, yes, endurance training in general significantly elevates cortisol levels, and it also reduces the 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 hormones. I'm trying to think of the right word, but I'm blanking on it. The hormones that help you repair damage and grow new protein structures, like human growth hormone and testosterone. Those are two of the most powerful hormones we have for regeneration. But and so strength training is kind of the opposite. Strength training will increase those happy hormones or good hormones and decrease cortisol levels. But with the kind of training that you're going to be doing, it sounds like, with a lot of low intensity training, yes, cortisol levels will be elevated. And it does depend on the time of day. The problem with trying to track cortisol is it's a laboratory test. And so there's no finger pick or finger stick to check blood to see what your cortisol levels are. You have to go to a laboratory, have them draw the blood out. So then you're just looking at what your cortisol was. You don't know what it is now, and it might take several days to get that reading. So I don't think it's practical to get too concerned about this, because I think that there's really little you can do to control it if you're going to be doing a lot of endurance training. Okay, the next thing is fixing these aerobic deficiencies. Yes, and it sounds like you are not a particularly high volume trainer, because you're saying that, spending a day in the mountains working above aerobic threshold for a long time, and doubling my planned workload is short-sighted. It's not short-sighted, but it will slow the process of increasing your aerobic capacity. And it's also going to increase your fatigue load substantially. So if you could spread that high volume out into 2 or 3 workouts during the week, I think you'll be better off. And I would endeavor to keep it at or below the aerobic threshold for most of those things. If they're, the fellow who introduced this concept of aerobic deficiency, Phil Maffetone, and I have done some podcasts together. But Phil turned me on to this in 1983 or 4, somewhere around there. But he told me at that point is that this period that you're in right now, you're calling it a transition period. That's fine to give it that name. That this is targeted at improving your aerobic capacity, fixing this aerobic deficiency. This is what he calls the patience phase. You just have to be patient. And yes, it will mean those days in the mountains either are going to be shorter or less intense. Maybe you don't get to go, you won't travel as far, but you need to be patient and let these adaptations take place. And you'll be surprised in 6 months the difference that it has made for you.
Yeah, that's some good advice for her with both questions. And I do think that cortisol part, Scott, that is something many high stress people deal with as well. And um, I know there's naturopathic doctors too that can check these as well if it's a big issue for people. So I think um that's something I know some friends have done. And not to promote naturopathy, we don't advocate medical or naturopath definitively, but there's lots of ways you can explore these issues if they are get help for them, I think. Alternative.
Yeah, I mean, I know, well, actually, one of the athletes I coach, high level athletes, is a naturopath. And I know I don't know much about it because I've never worked with a naturopath, but I know she has a lot of emphasis on hormone levels.
Yeah.
And I think that makes up a big part of, I'm assuming that makes up kind of a big part of their study. So
Hmm.
anyway, consulting people like that, I think could be beneficial. And yes, stress, that's cortisol is the stress hormone.
Yeah.
And elevated cortisol can come from, life stress, or it could come from training stress. And it doesn't matter which one it's coming from. And if you combine the two, life stress, a lot of
Hmm.
life stress on top of a lot of training stress, then you are potentially on trajectory for disaster, overtraining, injury, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I did a custom plan for a client this year who didn't have a high training load, but where it was an emergency medicine doctor, and they had just recently finished medical school. And just talking to him, the stress of work combined with even a low training volume was putting his body totally out of whack. So I think
Yeah.
taking into consideration, like you said, the global stress, not just your training load, is really important. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Our next question, the person said, I've read speed on the flats correlates to speed uphill. Can I substitute flat running below aerobic threshold for uphill training below aerobic threshold?
Mhm.
Appreciate any feedback you might have.
Um, I'm sure that there is some correlation between flat speed and hill speed. I don't think it's that strong. Some of the best uphill runners I've known and worked with over the years are not particularly fast, but they are really good at grinding uphill faster than most people. And so I don't think that just because there's a little, this gets back, is correlation causation or not? Or is it just the fact that you can see some correlation between flat speed and uphill speed? But is flat speed causing you to be faster uphill? That's questionable, I think. Now, most of the really good uphill runners also tend to be fairly good on the flats, but that's because they are often coming from a training background that included a lot of road running or flat running. Um, but I would say that the way to increase your leg speed, or speed, let's say, is to increase running economy. And that's something I
Mhm.
discussed a few questions ago, which is add hill sprints and add strides um, to your workouts. And both of those will build power in your legs that will result in a longer stride. And as a consequence, you'll go farther with each stride, and that means your running economy goes up. And I think that would be really important to add, or very simple but important changes to make to your training. Um, Speed uphill, though, I think it's so much related to there's muscle strength. And, you know, some of the
Mhm.
best, I mean, I used to hold this theory that I thought, boy, when those Kenyan and Ethiopian guys and men and women, if they're not good enough to win the big marathons, they're going to start filtering into mountain running. And I thought, oh, they'll just dominate because they're so fast. But it hasn't, there have been a few that have tried, and it has not proven very effective because the kind of leg strength it takes to run up and down hills fast for a long time is very different than the kind of leg strength it takes to run fast on the flats.
Mhm. Yeah, that you've nailed both of the key parts on the head is the economy and strength. So, um, yeah, I think anyone who wants to get faster, same same points for like I'm doing skimo, so um backcountry skiing or most sports, those are the two people often overlook is especially I think movement economy, like you were saying, uh really can help people speed up. Hmm.
Yeah, it definitely will. And adding a little bit of, I mean, you could do this in a gym with weights, but if you're at all time crunched, I think it's better to do it more sports specifically, and that's where the hill sprints and the strides come in. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, I think that
Sure.
I've had great success with adding those into people's training.
Awesome. Our next question, Scott, is from Spain, and this gentleman is asking, recently I've watched a YouTube video from a running coach who's a semi-elite marathoner with a 220 PB, formulating the theory that maybe a runner can increase or maintain the VO2 max doing VO2 max workouts on the bike instead of running. So the mechanical load is not as demanding. Any thoughts on this? If so, what length of intervals do you recommend? So I guess he's asking about high intensity intervals on the bike to speed up his running. hmm
Yeah, and so this goes to the heart of why people do VO2 max type training. And this is, as anybody who's played with high intensity intervals knows, this training is very hard. It's slow to recover from. And its main function, at least my understanding, is its main function is it increases the stroke volume of the heart, because that's the single biggest limiter to VO2 max. When you get to a point where your heart just can't pump any more blood. So let's say you could get to 180 beats per minute, but you have a smaller amount of blood that's ejected each time from each beat of the heart. Then you go and do some VO2 max type, some interval training. You get where you're going to be hitting that 175, 100 to 80 range in the heart rate frequently during that workout. The heart gets the signal to increase its elasticity. The pericardium that surrounds the heart doesn't give very much, but it can be preloaded. So the blood coming out of the atrium will go into the ventricle and kind of load it, like high pressurize the ventricle. And then when the heart contracts again, the ventricular contraction, you get a bigger, what they call an ejection fraction, more blood coming out of the heart. So, and there's a whole article on VO2 max and the misconceptions surrounding it and the origins of it, the history. I start with the guys who first figured out that this was a big deal back in the teens of the 20th century. So I would encourage you to go read that. I don't, if I do know a few athletes, one in particular, a guy named Kylee Jornet, some of you may have heard of, who does do a fair bit of high intensity training on a bicycle. But I've always thought, and I haven't asked Killian this particularly, because I've done this with other athletes too. I thought it was to train the ventilatory muscles, not so much the heart, because you can do this hard work, as you pointed out, Otris, you can do this hard work without the mechanical stress of running hard. You can do it on the bike more easily that way. And so I think there's some advantage to that. Now, the biomechanics, of course, of the two, running and cycling, are so different that there may be some. Again, I don't know. I mean, I'm speaking out of turn. I'm thinking through all this as I speak. If somebody's going to have to do a study on this, I suppose, can you, and is increasing your VO2 max making you faster? And I think that's something that's so important that people do not understand, is they don't give the awards at the races to the person with the highest VO2 max. They give the awards to the person that's the fastest. And as I've written in the books, there are three principal pillars of endurance that are the most determining of endurance performance. The most important one is your speed at your second threshold, or your anaerobic threshold. The next most important one is your running economy. How much energy does it cost you to run at this race pace that you're trying to maintain? And the third is VO2 max. And of those three, the correlations between the correlation between speed at VO2 max, or excuse me, speed at anaerobic threshold is incredibly high. Like it's like if you were to list a finish order of a race, 10-kilometer race, let's say, and I bet if you compared all of, not I bet, I've seen this done actually by a guy named Peter Snell, compare their speed at anaerobic threshold, you'd find almost a perfect ranking in those top runners, that the people
Mm.
that have faster speed at their anaerobic threshold, those are the ones that are going to win the race. And anaerobic threshold is not the same as VO2 max. It's below your VO2 max. You can't maintain VO2 max for more than a minute or two. It's not humanly possible. So anyway, so that's one thing to consider. The other is running economy. Now, running economy has a higher correlation than VO2 max. VO2 max has the worst correlation of these three elements we're talking about that are generally considered to be the best predictors of endurance performance. And its correlation is down in, R squared is something like 0.3, or, it's not very good, because you see big scatter in VO2 maxes. If you look at the race results and you look at some of the fastest runners ever, I mean, Frank Shorter had a really modest max VO2, and he is a two-time gold medalist in the Olympics in the marathon. I think there's VO2 max is overemphasized. It can be difficult to, I mean, I've had athletes I have improved their running economy by over 20% by technique training and strength and power development. If you work your butt off with VO2 max intervals, maybe you could change your VO2 max by 1 or 2%. So which one is better to spend your time on? I mean, it's no
Yeah.
question in my mind. Like, let's work on the things that are going to be the most important to making you faster. Because again, the awards go to the fastest runners, not the ones with the highest VO2 max.
Mhm. Yeah, Scott, it's interesting. I'm also wondering, I haven't watched this YouTube video, but the exact VO2 max workout this person's doing, because I've seen this is a bit of a buzzword right now on social media. I've seen lots of people posting about like a VO2 max workout or a double VO2 max workout day or that kind of stuff, but
Mm-hmm.
it actually doesn't make that any sense, even the title of it, because you can't exercise at your VO2 max for any amount of time. So it's a bit of a curiosity what they're even doing, perhaps.
Well,
Mhm.
there is the theory behind this goes back quite some years, but
Mhm.
yes, you're not going to actually probably be at VO2. Let's say you're doing 4 by 4 minutes. That's a very common VO2 max workout.
Yeah.
The first 2.5 minutes are getting you up to within, let's say, 95% of VO2 max. And
Mhm.
then the second couple of minutes are operating in this 95 to 99 or 100% of VO2 max. And they think that's where the stimulus comes from. And the reason for
Mm.
the 4-minute interval is it takes a while for your heart rate to respond and your heart to respond. So I think that's the rationale behind it. But there's so
Mhm.
many other things that are going on when you do
Mhm.
VO2 max training that, yes, there's probably an increase in stroke volume and ejection fraction from the heart. That's one of the principal things that the early researchers figured out, which is why they had their athletes train using this kind of interval. But the other is there's when you're training at that intensity, you're engaging the fastest endurance fibers that you have. The
Mhm.
highest power in of the, what do they call it? The type 2A fibers, type 1, type 2A fibers with the middle range fibers that can be trained to develop more aerobic or more slow twitch type um, capabilities. And so you're engaging a whole big new bunch of motor units that are getting a training stimulus that's an aerobic training stimulus for them because they're they fatigue. That's the reason you can't do max VO2 or VO2 max type training for very long is the muscles fatigue and they can't keep up that speed. But by stimulating that high intensity, but those faster twitch fibers over and over again can make them more aerobic. So they'll be able to sustain that type of output for longer. And that could be a very valuable, even if your VO2 max did go up, but those fibers became more aerobically adapted. So you could sustain a higher output for longer, then you're going to go faster. So it's the same thing we were talking about, the thing, if that's but is that because you're increasing your VO2 max or not? And or is it because of this adaptation is taking place peripherally at the muscle? And I've written quite extensively on this. There's a whole section in the book about what I think is the myths of VO2 max and how people don't understand it. I mean, I've worked with two Olympic cross-country skiers, both of whom have performed very well in the Olympics. So they're at the height of their sport. And they are as anybody knows anything about cross-country skiing, it's generally considered to the most aerobically demanding endurance sport because you're using all four limbs and you're running up and down hills. So what I saw with one of them in particular, who had a member of the US ski team before I started working with him, 10 years of VO2 max training with this guy from the time he was 18 till he was 28 when I started working with him. And I got when he's moved over to work with me, I got all of his testing that had been done by the US ski team. And in those 10 years, his VO2 max did not budge, despite the main focus of his training were these VO2 max intervals. And it would some days it would be a few beats, some tests it would be a couple percent higher and then a couple percent lower, but generally it hovered around this not very high level for cross-country skiers. But what I did when I started working with him is I figured, okay, you're 28 years old, your VO2 max you're genetically limited. This is as good as it's going to get. So what we need to do now is decrease the cost of skiing at this speed. We need to increase your movement economy. And we did that, and he made an enormous jump in terms of performance that next year. So again, it's way more complicated. VO2 max, I mean, I know it's important. I'm not poo-pooing it, but I just think it gets overemphasized and it's not well understood. So that's
Yeah, I see.
I'm getting off my soapbox now.
No,
Sorry.
no, it's
I get wound
it's
up over
good.
that stuff.
We like it, Scott. I think the listeners will enjoy this, but yeah, it is seemingly a really big cost benefit analysis if people are listening as to what you're training for, also your age, because that type of interval. The recovery it can take quite a long time, and especially as you're aging. So I think those are things to consider before just jumping on the YouTube video bandwagon workout. Is really analyzing, is it right for your goals? So
Yeah, and so that brings up a great point so I need to get back on my soapbox for a minute.
yeah.
And that is that it depends very much on the event you're training for. So when you get into the multi-hour events that most of the athletes we work with are doing, then VO2 max plays almost no role in the determining performance of the athlete. This in multi-hour, like I'm not talking about a 2-hour marathoner here. 2-hour marathoners running very fast, VO2 max will be important to that person because it will also allow them to elevate their second threshold up to a higher level. Because still the speed at that second threshold will be the biggest determining factor probably in their performance. But when you get into races or events, maybe it's not even a race, just say you're going to go for a long run in the mountains or you're going to go climb a bunch of mountains at one time. The bigger factor in fatigue is local muscular fatigue. is what's going to make you slow down. It's not that your VO2 max isn't low and isn't high enough. I mean, let's say you're out for 4 or 5 hours running around in the mountains, your heart rate is going to be so far below your VO2 max that your heart is never going to be limited in the amount of oxygen it can supply to those working muscles. It's always going to have excess capacity because you're so far below your VO2 max, because the intensity at 4 or 5 hours, the intensity needs to be low or you won't finish. And so if you're not being slowed down by having a high VO, because your VO2 max is, let's say, too low, and we know that it's primarily leg muscle fatigue that's causing you to slow down, then why are you doing all this VO2 max training? Why not do muscular endurance training? And I can tell you that with I work with some of the better ultra runners in the world. We never do VO2 max training, never, not once in the years and years I've been working with them. We do a lot of training closer and below that between the first and second threshold. We do quite a bit of training there because that's very specific to the energy demands and the speed of their event. So anyway,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, and in contrast, you work with myself and some other, World Cup schemo racers, and we're training for, a 4-minute event and a 10-minute event. And yes,
Yeah.
we all do high intensity because it
Yeah.
makes sense for the demands of what we're doing. So yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, you need to, it's very important. And, let's say you're a runner and you're doing the vertical kilometer race. Well, then, yes, you're going to need to include a bunch of high intensity training. I'm hesitant to use the term VO2 max training
Yeah.
because I think that what we call zone 4, it does so many other things besides improve VO2 max that it just like people are so focused on that term as if it were this, magic component. If I raise my VO2 max, I'm suddenly going to perform better.
Yeah. No, and
I
if
don't know if
the
some of
list
you, oh, go ahead.
I
Sorry,
was
I
gonna
cut you
say,
off.
if
Go ahead.
the listeners are more interested in this, Scott has written a few articles on our website, to deep dive in a little bit as well.
Well, I don't know Peter Attia at all. And I think he's an incredibly brilliant guy who has brought all kinds of very interesting things into the public sphere with his podcast called The Drive. And I listen to it often. But he's one of these people, I have to say, that's really caught up on VO2 max training. And
Yep.
a few months ago, he did a podcast with Olav Alexander Boo, who is the coach of the two Norwegian triathlon phenoms. These guys have won gold medals at the Olympics and they've won the Ironman World Championship. So everything from the Olympic distance all the way up to Ironman distance. And he's been coaching them for years. And so Peter Attia had him on the podcast and they were discussing VO2 max. And you could just hear it in Attia's voice as when they started talking about VO2 max, he, the pitch of his voice went up. He got really excited about it. And then he starts telling Olav, and I have worked with Olav in the past, so I don't know him well, but we've spent a lot of time talking and communicating about training. But Peter talks about these incredibly exhausting VO2 max workouts, these kind that literally had him almost falling off the bike. It's like a whole bunch of 2 or 3 minute uphill hard rides and just driving himself into utter exhaustion. And at the end of this, I mean, I could almost see it in Olaf because I know some of his thoughts on this as he's watching Peter. And at the end of Peter's little diatribe about VO2 max and how he did it, Olaf said, "We never do that." That was it. I ended the conversation right there. But anyway,
Yeah.
I could read between the lines a little bit. So anyway, that's just another little anecdote on VO2 max.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. And yeah, something I have learned a lot, and all the coaches or I think athletes who have worked with you, is we do very little. We do lots of hard efforts, but very little true max efforts, and we save that for when we race mostly. Um, and this is another tangent because Scott could go into how you don't get huge adaptations from fully going max, but you can get the same ones from just slightly below, and the cost is lower and the benefit is similar. So I think yeah,
Yeah.
maybe an article on that, Scott. Another one.
Yeah, I've been asked before to talk about this, this
Yeah.
Norwegian training method, and I think that would be
Mhm.
useful because I've found it to be tremendously helpful for athletes I'm working with.
Mhm.
I wish I'd known about it. I got sucked
Sooner.
into the whole VO2 max thing when I was an athlete.
Yeah.
Um, and so I've been down that road. But
Mhm.
this methodology that has come out of Norway in the past, it's probably, it's gained a lot of more public acceptance, but it's been around for 10, 15 years now. And
Mhm.
it's being used with tremendous success in events from as short as the cross country ski sprint, which is 3 or 4 minutes, up to ultra running races. And
Mhm.
we could talk about the theories behind that and how could be done or normally is done and stuff like that. So that might be a good idea.
Mhm. Yeah, that would be. All right, let's move on to our next question here, Scott. We have two more questions, so we're nearing the end. But this person has a question regarding wearing masks during aerobic training, specifically running. Unfortunately, the Lauren is her name, says, I live in an area with poor quality air quality during the winter, generally AQI 100 to 150, and I've noticed in the past 2 years that this has an effect on my breathing when exercising. To compensate, I've started wearing single-use N95 masks during easy aerobic runs. I find these the best as other types with valves do not fit me well. Although it can feel a bit suffocating, it is doable if I keep the run very easy. I do notice that my heart rate is higher with a mask, particularly when it gets wet after a while from exhaled air, and it feels like I'm sucking in air. My questions are, one, if I have to run slower to keep the heart rate aerobic, sometimes with walking breaks, am I still getting the same training effect? Um, should
No, you're
we?
not getting
Mhm.
exactly the same training effect, unfortunately, but you will still be getting a good aerobic stimulus from this. I mean, obviously, running faster with a lower heart rate, that's kind of the goal of all this type of training. Um, and that would be more easily accomplished by being able to run faster. And you're easily trained by running faster. But in your case, that doesn't sound like it's a possibility. Could you go indoors train in an air-conditioned space on a treadmill? You might find that way more effective training for you, despite the boredom of running on
Mhm.
a treadmill. So I guess I would have to say that they're not going to be exactly the same training effect because you're not recruiting at the same volume of muscle mass if you're running slower than if you're running faster.
Mhm. Yeah, agreed. Her second question was, are there any concerns that you know of for running with masks? Are there any potential positives?
I don't know of any concerns.
Mhm.
I think there can be a potential positive, and something you alluded to or mentioned in your first question, which is that it feels a little bit suffocating. So what that means is the ventilatory muscles, the diaphragm, the intercostals, and the ribs, they're all getting a better training effect when you're breathing harder. And
Mhm.
so, yes, that would be a potential positive. Not just potential, I think it would be a positive.
Yeah, that does make sense. And also the positive of actually being able to just go outside, which is good
Yeah.
uh mentally for people. And then her third question we just touched on briefly. Do you have any other suggestions for tips for people that deal with low air quality? Because um Yeah, we're lucky in North America that's not as big of an issue, but I do know of many places in the world where that would be a daily occurrence. So that is a good
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, I think, I know that treadmills are not, not everybody's got a treadmill in their basement or access to gyms with treadmills, but that's probably the best substitute, especially on days when the air quality is really bad, or if you have a training session that's scheduled that's somewhat higher intensity, then, or if you want to, or in your case, Lauren, you want to learn to run faster at lower heart rates, then you're probably going to have to do that on a treadmill indoors where the air is cleaner.
Mm-hmm, for sure. Our last question, Scott, is from Jake, and he says, "I'm curious about further reading and learning for coaching. Do you have other book, magazine, blog, etc. recommendations in relation to training and coaching? Also, do you have any recommendations around online learning? I've looked at the UESCA certifications, and I'm curious whether you think this or other online certifications are valuable. I want to learn more to improve my own training uh, and improve as a coach." This is a good question.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Um, So I wrote an article on the website that's a bibliography, and these are recommended readings. There's some of them I still refer to today. But all of them have been proven really valuable in shaping my approach to training. So go find that article on the website and look at those things. Buy those books if you need them. One of them is right here. You can see I keep it within arm's reach. This book right here, Lore of Running, you notice it's 1,000 pages. Um, you will learn so much about physiology and training methods and the whole history of training for running and things like that. It's a really fascinating book. I've given away many of them as presents to people to, hey, just read this and you'll be good. Most people can't get through the 1,000 pages, but
Hmm.
and that book is of course on my list as one of the ones I suggest that people read. Now, as far as the certification goes, um, I believe that maybe it will come to pass that those types of certifications will become meaningful in terms of trying to land a job as a coach. Right now, I don't think they would help most people in their tasks of trying to become a coach. Um, I think you can learn. I mean, I learned all of this on my own by digging around for years and years on the internet and getting books. Um, I think you can learn a lot on your own if you're motivated, and you
Hmm.
don't need necessarily to pay a lot of money to get a certification. Now, I'm sure that the certification course, I'm not curious, I'm not uh, really, I'm not familiar with it. So I can't say, but I would suspect it's a pretty good course. I would suspect it
Hmm.
covers a lot of this ground. Um, and so there would be, there's no real disadvantage other than the fact that it's going to cost you a lot of money, and maybe it's a nice certificate to hang on your wall, but is it going to make people want to have you as their coach? I think that's questionable.
Yeah, I'd say like even all the coaches at Evoke, we all come with our personal histories and usually like extensive athletic backgrounds ourselves. But then when we are trained through you and mentored at Evoke, it's largely based on your book. We learned that inside and out with you, and Scott's done such a great job of his book study that anyone could hop on YouTube and learned so much with that. And then the other
Yeah,
piece I think
a good point.
many coaches have maybe previously to coming to Evoke is some form of personal training certification because it teaches you all about the strength training component and um, less the aerobic side, but about your body that way. So that's another piece that people could look into. Whether the certification means something or not, it's just the knowledge that you get from those that kind of a course.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
And if you're inclined to, and if it would help you learn, if it would like give you more discipline, if you had homework assignments and things like that, that you would study more deeply, and then I
Mm-hmm.
would say all then yeah, maybe the course is this kind of certification course is the best method for you. But I
Mm-hmm.
believe you could do a tremendous amount of learning, and I've tried to make it easier for people to learn these things because I'm distilling, I've read dozens of books about this stuff and studied so many different coaches that I've tried to distill it down into a kind of somewhat concise methodology that most people, it seems to work quite well, and that most people
Mm-hmm.
can grasp. You do not need an advanced degree in exercise science to be a good coach. I
Mm-hmm.
can promise you that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm not sure what the equivalent is in the United States, but in Canada we have something called National Coaching Institute or NCI, and it is excellent. You learn a lot, but everyone comes out of it there thinking kind of the same thing. So I think it is even valid to explore and analyze different approaches and ideas so that as a coach you can um, arrive at how you coach and why you coach that way, which is something you've tried to teach us all very well at Evoke. It's not just we do this because we do this. There's always
Yeah.
so much knowledge behind it, which is important.
We do like to understand
Yeah.
it's important to understand some of the physiology, although again, you don't need to be a physiologist. You do not need to be
Hmm.
able to describe every step of the electron transport chain inside the mitochondria. That's not going to make you a better coach. You just have to have a general understanding of what these things do and how these concepts fit together. And it's really the application of the theory, which comes from the physiology. It's the application of that to real world athletes that
Hmm.
I don't think any coaching course that I know of can do. You have to roll up your sleeves and start coaching some of your friends for free
Hmm.
and see how they do, and you'll get a lot of feedback. And that's how you're going to learn of, like, how do you translate theory into practice?
Hmm. For sure. And I mean, I don't know if all the coaches would agree with me on this one, but I think even being coached yourself, like if you've never been coached, it is hard to understand that coach athlete relationship. So
Mhm.
that's also an interesting place to start to learn. And as you always say, Scott, coaching is an art and a science. So um,
Yeah.
just because you get a whole bunch of certifications and knowledge, there's still the art piece of applying it to dynamic humans that will take some
Yeah,
practice. Hmm.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah. Well,
Well,
I
this
think,
has been another good session, Kylie. We really
yeah,
and we still have a few questions that have come in just in the last day or so that we're going to
yeah,
have to push to next month because we've gone a bit. It's getting late where you are right now,
yeah,
and all good athletes should be getting ready for bed about this time. So if you're in
yeah.
if it's 8 o'clock at your
It
um,
is. It's 8:40. That's a good reminder, Scott. And but
yeah.
I always enjoy talking with you of these questions, and thanks for continuing to send us so many interesting ones. I always think we're going to get repeats, and we hardly ever do. So that's
Yeah,
remarkable.
it's
Yeah.
great. I think it's hopefully it sound and it feels to us like it is stimulating, getting the gears turning, and they're starting to
Hmm.
think about this stuff. And some of these questions really demonstrate that. So thanks a lot for sending them in, and keep doing it. And we will
Hmm.
see you next month.
Yeah. Thanks.